So today I'm with Georg Hajdu, a composer, researcher. How else would you describe yourself?
Well, I guess that describes me more or less. I think I used to be also a natural scientist at some point. I got a degree in molecular biology, but that was so a long time ago. But it did inform my approach to music quite a bit.
Great. Yeah, actually, I was going to ask. So, is this mathematical kind of approach into the compositions that you're currently involved with somehow inspired or is from your background?
Whether there's a distinction between my work in science and my work in composition, I would say I was the same person with the same kind of interest in the materiality of our world, and I look at music as a form of matter, that you can describe probably with very similar laws. I think that kind of remained.
And is this still carrying into your practice now, like in your research into rhythms, for instance, like very distinct musical materials?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said, I'm very much interested in the physicality of music and musical objects, and I was always interested in how things develop. There's an evolution in music, which is very similar to evolution in biology. I mean, you have species and you have genres, species in biology, and you have genres in music. You have environments in both areas that have a huge impact on so to speak, the practice. So in other words, I see almost biology as like a huge orchestra, so like life, like a huge orchestra. Very similar to how music functions.
Very rich and generative, which is
absolutely
something that you particularly address in your tools that you create for music creation.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. And and can we talk a bit more about like what you're working on now, the digital notation and natural music, for example?
Right. Yeah. Currently, I'm very interested in bringing generative music to the healthcare sector. That's a big project that we are currently pursuing at the Ligeti Center. It's we are applying some of these generative algorithms to processes that are supposed to calm people down, to have a healing or at least a effect that reduces anxiety in hospital waiting areas. And so that's very interesting because you have to ask yourself what type of music actually works in these environments and what type of music doesn't work. And so we're slowly trying to understand that sounds that are favored by patients, whether they hear them consciously or on an unconscious level as part of the atmosphere of their environment. It doesn't really make a difference, but what we realize is that people react positively to certain types of sounds. So we want to understand what's the characteristics of these sounds. So we look at the temporal development of sounds, we look at the spectral development, and we're trying to also eventually use artificial intelligence to generate sounds that exhibit these qualities. We're embarking on a series of studies that has the aim of decoding the secrets of sounds that we consider more soothing and that exhibit the quality of reducing anxiety in hospital waiting rooms, and and also to use artificial intelligence to basically expand on that, and in terms of like feeding a corpus into a latent space and creating sounds that have very similar qualities. I think artificial intelligence will help us a great deal to to create sounds that exhibit a large variability, a large spectrum of qualities that that can serve this purpose. Yeah.
Yes, so we should use it for its potential to go beyond, I guess, just probing in the dark of what certain algorithms could do.
That's right, and of course the secrets are always in the sound, right? So in other words, it's like you look at the things like attack and centroid and fluctuation, and there's a lot of talk about monaural beats and binaural beats and about the healing power of that, and I have to say that I'm quite skeptical. Yeah, I'd rather rely on the intuition of trained musicians and of patients. So we're not using necessarily hard science in this. We work with music therapists who are trained to do qualitative studies rather than quantitative. So, but on the other hand, we are also required to when talking to doctors and so they're very much interested in hard evidence. So we kind of have to balance these two sides a little,
Yeah, you could do mixed methods and use quantitative, just extrapolating.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. You're totally right, and that's what it's going to come down to. Use mixed method. But once again, I believe what you really have to. Eventually, you have to rely on your intuition, and that's what you do as a composer anyway. Because when you're a composer and you're composing music, you are your most critical listener, right? You have to put yourself in the shoes of the audience, and then it's quite interesting, But we can elaborate on that. But I guess you have other questions too, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, let's go back a little bit to how did you get involved with making music through like digital notation and. Yeah, you talked a lot about Clarence Barlow today in the presentation.
Yeah, well, I guess it started well before I met Clarence, but Clarence had a huge impact on me, on my compositional life. I think I grew up in a household where my father was he still is, a theoretical physicist, and my grandma, my mother's side, is a concert pianist who was trained at the Liszt Academy in Budapest. So I had these two influences, and one of my relatives is also a composer who used to be friends with Ligeti and Kortag in the 1950s. So I guess that was my my background. So I leaned in both directions, and I had somewhat of a hard time deciding what I was going to do. Yeah. And then, indeed, when I met Clarence in the early 1980s, I knew that this was exactly what I wanted. This is like there was a guy who creates music, but based firmly in science and math. And so that I thought, this brings both elements, together in a very fruitful and convincing way. So I stayed on that path ever since.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so, what kind of skills do you think you engage when you're making music with digital notations?
Well, what kind of skill sets do you need? I think what you need is you need to have, just let me put it this way. I think you need to have a right brain and a left brain. If you're too much of an engineer, your music might sound boring. If you apply too much intuition, I always felt music the music might lack some qualities, but that's of course my personal attitude. So I always felt that music had to bring both sides together, or at least my music. It had to be left brain and right brain. It has to be. And I gave a piece of mine, an early piano piece, I gave it the title Logarithmen. So loga derived from logos, which means logic and rationality in Greek, and rhythm as the physical element, intuitive, the bodily element, and bringing these two together, not seeing them as necessarily as contradictions. In the 60s, 70s, maybe well into the 1980s, music, as it was practiced in wide areas in Germany, it was very cerebral. You know, it's like Darmstadt.
Serialism.
Yeah, right. You know.
Remember that? Yeah.
Yeah.
The polemics.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't remember. I wasn't alive then, but yeah, I've read about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, but specifically, when you are making a piece, let's say, do you employ some of the tools that you've developed? Do you work with Max
right.
Score or?
Yes.
How do you?
Right.
What's your process?
My process is that of shuffling things from the right brain to the left brain and back and forth. So it's like a dialectic process. I mean, I couldn't compose without intuition, but I couldn't also compose without kind of a firm belief in strategy and in formalistic approaches. So I try to capture intuition, and by developing it, by creating a framework around it, that also allows me to go beyond certain things. Because I have an idea, but you know, when you only have an idea, you ask yourself, you know, okay, you can write 5 measures, but how are you going to get beyond that? So by analyzing, you know, the things that that you create intuitively, and trying to extrapolate, it opens up a door which allows you not just to formalize your own thoughts and ideas, but it also allows you to go beyond that, to create large-scale forms. And I did this many times. I think maybe most I guess the best example would be this opera of mine, which I created during the second half of the 1990s, which really tries to negotiate, you know, the elements of intuition and elements of planning, of detailed planning. And this opera is based on the idea of analyzing a sentence that the librettist spoke and performing spectral analysis on that, and then deriving, by stretching the sentence 1,000 times, but deriving every single aspect of the opera, but then still allowing for enough intuition to come into play. So it's always a back and forth, a dialectic play between intuition and formalization.
Great, and as I understand, the tools you develop actually are kind of a little bit around this idea of
right.
proposing different rhythmic things and kind of playing around with an idea until you arrive at something, I guess.
Yeah, for instance, I developed a tool, like extension of Max Score called Macaque, which is based on an early piece of software, which is actually also based eventually, I mean, basically going back to an idea that Clarence Barlow had in the early 1980s, and which he also realized in his piece Am Januar am Nil, which uses sentences. He performed spectral analysis on sentences and had an orchestra speak those sentences. And he used his own approaches. Then later on at CINMAT in California, they had developed a tool for spectral analysis, which I used to analyze the sentence by the librettist. And myself felt very compelled to develop a similar tool. So it's always like, oh, I have an idea, and I want to put this idea into effect. But how am I going to get there? So I need to develop a tool, right? So and then it's all about the affordances of the tool. Is the tool powerful enough to realize the original idea, or do I have to work on it until I get there, until I can formalize and realize my ideas to the extent that they seem natural? Yeah. So that's always something that I try to pursue when I develop my own tools. But I also have people in mind, of course. It's not these tools are not just for myself. I also I'd like to design them in ways that the community can also participate. That I can, yeah, sharing is an important element. Yeah.
And is that part of like why you're so interested in network music, for instance, like sharing it with other musicians who are far, or is that not part of
it has to do with the community building, definitely. Overcoming distance. You know, if you want to go deeper into my own personal psychology, you will probably find something there.
So I'm just wondering, we talked about your current projects, the hospital one.
Yeah.
Is there other ones that are kind of related to the kinds of tools you're developing?
Yeah, definitely. I'm about to embark on another project, an opera project that I've been toying around with for quite some time. It's a commission, originally by the Karlsruhe Theater, but it came to a sudden stop. So we're trying to kind of find a new theater to realize the project. It's a post-colonial project that I'm doing with a writer of Indian descent who has lived in Africa for a while, and who is very much concerned about colonialism and question of equality, pressing issues. So I asked her to come on board when I read her book, and so what's interesting about this is it's also centered around recordings again. So again, in my first opera, I took the voice of the librettist and developed the entire opera out of that. And now we are working with recordings that have been made at around the turn of the 20th century by ethnomusicologists traveling to Africa and with these phonographs. And so there's an archive with about 15,000 different recordings in Berlin. It's called the Berlin Phonogram Archive. And so the idea is to pick some of them and turn these objects into living objects and putting them centerpiece in this opera and creating the libretto around it, like in some sort of a centrifugal way. But the librettist has isolated 2 of these recordings, which she had transcribed. She went to Africa to ask people, to transcribe the text for her, because they were spoken in a rather unusual language. And so the idea once again is that of, if you were to ask me, so what is your compositional approach? I think I would call myself like some sort of an alchemist or a chemist that extracts things, living musical objects from other objects. So it's like a series of extractions and distillations until I get to the music that appeals to me. And so I'm very much inclined to apply the same kind of strategy to this new opera.
Kind of like going back to your natural sciences background, the extractions.
Yeah, in certain ways, it is, and maybe some people ask me, don't you ever trust your intuition?
But it sounds like you use both.
I think a lot. And that's where my scientific background comes in, is our justification. You have to kind of justify your approach by embedding ideas into a framework, into an overarching framework. That was always my approach composing music.
But as I understand, you're always very interested in media and kind of mediated performances. Is it still, like, from your first opera, is it still quite present in the work now, or are you going more towards kind of compositional processes that you spoke about today, for instance, like in this opera, for instance, are you using quite a lot of different media, different lights, videos?
We are.
Yeah, multimedia is a big aspect.
Definitely. I mean, one important element is the use of a phonograph. So we want to actually put two of these Edison phonographs on the stage and feature them as if they were living beings, right? And also to have them play back digital recordings, right? So it's like in certain ways, what I am also very much interested is the theatrical element of these things, the make-believe element of theater. I wrote about this in a paper called Embodiment and Disembodiment in Network Music Performance, where I'm stating that what's important for composition is not necessarily causality, but plausibility. So, in other words, plausibility is at the center of theater. Causality is what makes science tick, and that's the big difference between the two. But things that are plausible can also be causal, but don't necessarily have to be causal. So that's something that you have to understand. When you have a science background, and you work in areas of music theater, you have to understand that science is it gives you an important framework, but you have to go beyond that. You have to understand that music and theater are forms of storytelling. So the storytelling element always has to be top priority.
Yeah, and so you work more with this kind of art idea in the end, right? Instead of what theater looks like, instead of proving how science could solve this, I guess.
Yes, and so it was interesting to come to that conclusion. Of course, as a composer, you work with media for a long time, and you also work with the connection between different types of media, and then you ask yourself, how do they relate themselves? What type of counterpoint do they create? What kind of rules do you have to apply when you work with different media? Is there something like parallel motion? Is there something like contrary motion? So how do you describe that? Do they form textures like homophony, heterophony, that kind of thing? They do. They work. Even if you work with very heterogeneous media, they can be subject to some of the same laws as the musical counterpoint. Yeah, so that's very interesting. But in the end, when you look at how they relate to each other, in terms of causality or plausibility, I think plausibility is what really matters. I think is a person who really was able to capture that is Mark Applebaum here in his piece Aphasia, where he kind of reversed cause and effect. I'm not sure whether you know this piece of his, right? Right. It's a piece where he basically follows a tape, but very precisely, and the performance makes the impression that actually he is triggering certain sounds. He's like using the same technologies, or no, he's not using a technology, but he's using the semblance of something, of applying a technology that's capable of triggering his actions to trigger certain effects. But in reality, cause and effects are reversed, and that's kind of very interesting to find out. Because it's surprising, and it just makes you think also about the relationship. It's like, do you need to prove something with your art, or do you just want to establish a relationship, whether or not it's actually really there or not? It could be an illusion.
Yeah. So is that what you pursue, establishing your relationship in your
That's what I'm pursuing. It's trying to establish relationships. Yes, that's right. Yeah, definitely.
And does it extend to like musicians you work with? Do they get like the effect that you're going for, or do you kind of, or they know intellectually that's what it is, or like how do you kind of bring them into your compositional world?
That's a very good question. When I look at my work that I did with the European Bridges Ensemble, for instance, my network music performance ensemble, I think a lot was about that. Overcoming disembodiment in a network music performance environment. So the question is, when you work in an environment which is genuinely disembodied, where you know, Milo Pocket once wrote a paper calling, which he called not being there. You know, if you're not there, how do you create that impression of being there?
Yeah.
And I guess a lot of what I did is in this area was about that. It's like give people the impression of being there. You know, the audience impression of being there. How do you achieve that? I mean, give you an example of a piece of mine for it's actually a transcription or an arrangement of a piece by John Cage called Radio Music, but it was completely in the digital realm. So it was about 5 performers manipulating controllers. You had like an interface which I created in Jitter that looked like a radio, except that now you had like 5 cursors instead of just one. And you have radio stations, and you had I was mixing the sound files with noise, so that sounded like FM stations. And it was the same idea, but that Cage did in 1956 with his analog radios, and you know, but it was entirely in the digital realm, and now it was again a question of plausibility. So how do you create the impression of an analog radio when the frequency bands that Cage was using in the 1950s don't even exist? Right? They went silent.
Yeah.
So there's 2 possibilities. You can either do a piece that's completely silent, or you move into the digital realm and mimic the experience that people had in the 50s.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot going on right now actually with people taking the old technology and trying to mimic the experience in some like kind of reconstructing old
Yeah, that's a good word.
Performances like Nono's pieces, for instance, or you know, the talks we had today a few days ago about Vares's piece, and how it's probably going to be impossible to reconstruct because even that space is gone. So the plausibility is still an aspect that could help with that, do you think?
Yeah, you know what? By the way, I just help me with the name of the presenter, the Italian musicologist, Leo.
Izzo?
Yeah, Leo Izzo, right? Or Izzo, I guess it is. I don't know exactly, but I suggested to him maybe he would consider approaching a company that does 3D printing of buildings. Right. So maybe one company might actually to embark on a really interesting project by 3D printing the original space that they did Poème Électronique. You know, and then once again you have the digital technology applied to something that's in the analog domain, but it adds a completely different quality to that.
Yeah, it's not going to be concrete. Actually, I'm still curious on the question I asked you earlier. So, to recreate this kind of disembodied experience, how do you approach like performers? How to engage with it and to feel like they are performing, like in the flow of doing your work? Is it a challenge? Do you find?
I have to think of a particular work, and what that's another thing that I'm preoccupied with, also in the context of the opera, but also other contexts, is audience participation,
Right.
engagement, composition as a social experience. And a lot of my work for scores is about that, the scrolling scores, very similar to what Kat does with the decibel score player. We've done quite a few works with that too, and so one idea, and then that was also realized in the St. Pauli Elbtunnel project that we did in 2019, where we had 144 musicians placed around the two tubes of the Elbtunnel, and so the idea was to engage musicians with digital scores, scrolling scores. And I have to say that the feedback that I had been receiving was overwhelmingly positive. A lot of people felt like they actually that these scores were enabling them, empowering them to play together with others. So it's like taking this idea of network music composition, but just blowing it up into communities of amateur musicians or non-musicians even. Getting them involved, blurring the boundaries between traditional audiences and performers. I think nowadays, where people have less and less patience to just sit through a concert of 1.5 hours of music, and people want to do something, and I think digital scores can have that element of engaging people, and about that. You're part of a project that studies that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So it is kind of changing the context in where and how you present your music, right? It won't be just in theaters, but maybe in open spaces.
Right. I mean, these days you can't even assume familiarity with certain types of music. I mean, 20 years ago, you could probably talk about Stockhausen, and everyone knew what I was talking about. These days, it's very difficult to find a common denominator when I talk to people. It's like people come with such diverse backgrounds, and nothing is stable anymore. Politically, in terms of gender, and in many other ways, stability has vanished. And so what we can do as composers, we can provide a certain amount of stability by giving people experiences, experiences that might connect people to other people, giving them some sort of a community, a sense of community. And of course, I wouldn't claim that this is what I do. But at least this is something that I have been trying in various in some of my pieces.
It's a strong motivation to provide this kind of sense of connectivity.
It's a total motivation, and I wish I had more time to delve deeper into this. If I were 20 years younger, this is what I probably would explore to the max. Just like when I did another opera with a friend of mine at the Munich Biennale. It was supposed to be like an internet opera in 2002. And we noticed that the team that was assembled to produce the opera did not speak the same language. So we could not agree on anything. And the problem was there was no practice for what we did. Right, and so the entire production suffered from that, and that's when I decided to start my own ensemble to just systematically explore the affordances of network music performance. So and then of course, this practice became commonplace to the extent that in 2015 we all felt our work was done.
It's really fascinating how your love of kind of physics and natural science and music and intuition work together in your music. So is there anything else you'd like to mention that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of something. I think microtonality is also an important element in my work, because I love it when things are a little different, and so I was also always very interested in scales and different tunings, and also pushing the boundaries in that area. So my work in the Bull and Pierce scale was also very important to me, and I was also instrumental in developing a few new instruments, acoustic instruments, so that we would be able to bridge certain practices. And I do firmly believe in hybridity. I believe that it's extremely interesting to mix things. It's like to take the a traditional 12-tone temperament and to mix it with Bull and Pierce, and to go between the cracks, and try things, and you know what it is. It's like, the older you get, the more you let go of rules, because you realize that we as humans, we're so willing to accept whatever we hear, if it's presented in a convincing and plausible way. and then people who are holding on to like their systems, and so they will be surprised how much freedom there is once you give up on that, and once you just freely mix things and just let your ears decide whether that works or not. That's maybe a final statement.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Georg.
yeah.
And, we'll get back
My
to the
pleasure,
conference.
Salomia. Yeah.
No problem.